There was a time when football grounds weren't designed to impress anyone. They weren't sleek. They weren't comfortable. And they certainly weren't perfect. On cold Saturday afternoons, rain dripped through aging roofs onto rows of supporters below. Steel pillars blocked parts of the pitch. Concrete terraces shook beneath thousands of stamping feet. Sometimes, if you stood near the front, you were close enough to hear every argument between players, every shout from the manager, every crunching tackle on the touchline. By today's standards, many of those grounds would seem flawed. Some would even seem ridiculous. Yet ask older supporters about the places they miss most, and the names come back instantly. Highbury. Roker Park. The baseball ground. Not because they were modern. Not because they were beautiful. But because they felt alive. Every ground had its own quirks. Its own sounds. Its own smells. Its own personality. And for generations of fans, football wasn't just played there. Part of their lives happened there too. This is the story of when football grounds had real character. Long before football became a global business, going to a match felt remarkably local. The experience didn't and appos, begin at the turnstiles. It began several streets away. On Saturday afternoons, entire neighborhoods seemed to move in the same direction. Families emerged from rows of terraced houses. Friends met at familiar street corners. Supporters in scarves and heavy coats drifted through narrow roads that had seen generations of match days before them. Many football grounds were and appos, built on the edge of towns. They sat right in the middle of ordinary communities. From bedroom windows, residents could often see the floodlights towering above rooftops. For local children, those floodlights felt almost magical. A promise that something special was about to happen. As kickoff approached, the streets grew busier. Program sellers called out the latest edition. The smell of chips drifted from nearby takeaways. Pub doors swung open as supporters squeezed in for one last drink before the match. Every corner seemed to contribute something to the occasion. A burger van here. A newspaper stand there. A familiar face selling scarves outside the ground. None of it felt organized by a marketing department. It simply grew around the club over decades. The football ground was an appos, separated from daily life. It was part of daily life. The stadium belonged to the neighborhood, and the neighborhood belonged to the stadium. For many supporters, some of their strongest football memories were an appos, even inside the ground. They were walking hand in hand with a parent through crowded streets. Meeting friends at the same pub every weekend. Or catching that first glimpse of the floodlights rising above the rooftops. Because before the chants began, before the referee blew his whistle, before a ball was kicked, the matchday experience had already started. And once supporters finally stepped through the turnstiles, they entered a world that was even more distinctive. You were almost on the pitch. One of the biggest differences between old football grounds and modern stadiums was an appos, what you saw. It was how close you felt to everything. Today, supporters often sit behind advertising boards, security barriers, and carefully designed runoff areas. There is space between the crowd and the action. In many older grounds, there was hardly any space at all. The front rows seemed almost part of the pitch itself. Supporters could lean forward and feel as though they were standing right on the touchline. When a player chased a loose ball, he was running straight at them. At grounds like Roker Park, the connection between players and supporters felt immediate. The crowd wasn't an appos, watching from afar. They were right there. Every tackle, every argument, every burst of frustration unfolded only a few yards away. Players could hear the supporters. And supporters could certainly hear the players. Instructions shouted across the pitch. Complaints aimed at referees. The colourful language that rarely made it onto television broadcasts. Nothing was hidden. Nothing felt distant. At Derby County and Apple's famous baseball ground, the closeness could be even more dramatic. The pitch often became heavy and muddy during winter months. When challenges flew in, clumps of mud sometimes followed. Supporters near the front didn't and Apple's just watch the match. They experienced it. Of course, by modern standards, many of these arrangements would appear cramped and impractical. Safety regulations changed. Grounds evolved. Football moved on. But many supporters still remember those old touchlines fondly. Because when the crowd stood only a few feet away, football felt less like a spectacle. And more like a shared experience. And once fans looked beyond the touchline itself, they discovered another peculiarity of old football grounds. Sometimes you couldn't and Apple's even see the entire pitch. If you close your eyes and ask older supporters what they remember most about the old grounds, many won't mention a famous goal, or a league table, or even a particular match. They'll remember how the place felt. Football grounds once had a personality that reached far beyond the game itself. You could smell them before you properly saw them. On cold afternoons, the scent of meat pies drifted through the concourses and beneath the stands. Nearby, steaming cups of Bovril warmed frozen hands as supporters huddled against the winter air. For generations of fans, that smell became inseparable from football. One whiff was enough to tell you exactly where you were. Then there was the cigarette smoke. Before smoking bans changed public life, it floated beneath stadium roofs and across crowded terraces. It mixed with the smell of damp coats, wet scarves, and muddy boots. It wasn't pleasant. But it was familiar. And somehow, it became part of the atmosphere. The sounds were just as distinctive. The metallic clatter of turnstiles. The rustle of match-day programs. The low murmur of thousands of conversations before kickoff. Then, suddenly, the roar. Unlike modern stadiums filled with giant screens and constant announcements, old grounds often felt less controlled. More organic. The crowd created the soundtrack. Not a speaker system. And then there were the imperfections. The things modern architects would probably try to eliminate. Rainwater dripping through aging roofs. Puddles forming beneath the back rows. Concrete stairways darkened by decades of weather. Cold winds finding their way through every gap and corner. Sometimes supporters spent 90 minutes shifting sideways just to avoid a steady drip from above. Yet years later, those are often the details people remember. Not because they were enjoyable, but because they were real. The old grounds didn't feel polished. Every stain, every crack, every worn step seemed to tell a story. Perhaps that's why so many supporters still speak about them with such affection. The memories aren't glamorous. They're not postcard memories. They're ordinary moments. The smell of a pie. The warmth of a Bovril. The sound of rain striking a corrugated roof. And sometimes, the most powerful memories are the ordinary ones. Because they remind us that football wasn't just something people watched. It was something they experienced with all their senses. And nowhere were those imperfections more visible than in the grounds themselves. Today, many of those famous grounds exist only in photographs, old television footage, and fading match-day programs. The pillars are gone. The muddy pitches are gone. The leaky roofs are gone. In many cases, the stadiums themselves have disappeared completely. Yet for millions of supporters, the memories remain remarkably clear. They can still picture the exact spot where they stood on a freezing Saturday afternoon. They remember who stood beside them, who scored, who celebrated. They were places where friendships grew, traditions were passed down, and generations came together. For many fans, those old grounds didn't and appos simply reflect their clubs. They reflected their lives.